Hey guys, so tonight I'm going to show you guys how you can implement a 2D animated character into your live action footage. Think of this as a tutorial on how to replicate the Space Jam look or the Roger Rabbit look, but I like to call it the Space Jam look more because I think Space Jam holds a very cheesy spot in our hearts. So I'm going to show you guys the clip on what we're going to work with or what we're going to do. So we have the character dancing in this live action footage that I took from my office space at work. Anyways, the character is dancing in the footage. Here we can see that the character matches the color and the lighting of the overall scene. There's floor reflections of the same character. It's not perfect with the foot placement, but it'll do for now. And also, if you notice here, there's a slight shadow. Again, it's not perfect, but it's one of those things that we might want to consider when trying to replicate or implement a character in your footage. Now, first of all, let me start by saying this effect is really easy to do, and I'll show you guys how to do it step by step while implementing some creativity stuff like lighting and reflections. Again, very easy, and also it's all done in 2D. There's no 3D camera, no 3D planes. It's all just the video and our character Bon Bon dancing. So, let's get started. Alright, next I want to make a new composition. And the new composition is me basically redoing what I've done already here, so that you guys can see how I actually made the shot. So I'm going to right click the project window and hit new composition, or you can go to your composition tab and hit new composition. Either way, what's best for you. I'm just going to call this motion track dance 2D. It's 1920 by 1080 pixels, so that's the standard ratio for HD ratios. And the frames per second is 24. That's the standard for animation, at least. The duration, you can put anything you want, but you can always render way less than you put for the duration. Anyways, I'm going to hit OK. Now we have a blank slate. I'm going to start putting in the videos I want. Well, the files that I need. So these are videos that I took at my office space or where I work. I'd like to use this background. It's got a lot of cool things that I can play around with, such as reflections, the lighting, maybe some shadows. And also there's a lot of accents. Accents meaning there's a lot of specific things that are important later on, and it'll be useful for motion tracking. I'll explain that later. So I'm going to actually drag this stuff and place it into my project window. Now I have the file inside. Now I'm going to load up the animation. This is the character I'll be using. I actually animated him in TV Paint. You can choose whatever software you want to animate with, but for this case I'm just going to use TV Paint. And to make it accessible for everyone, I'm actually going to export the character as an image sequence, PNG preferably. The thing with animation softwares is that it must be able to export into an image sequence. And an image sequence is basically not a video file, but a series of images that are in order that represent frames of your animation. Now, I'm going to make a PNG sequence of this character. But first, I don't know if I showed you guys the loop. Here's the dance. Alright, next, I'm going to export the character as his own PNG sequence. So, the format is PNG. If you use any other software, make sure it's a PNG, and it can be alpha channel. So, RGBA for this case, it can read alpha, meaning it can see things that are transparent. You know, in TV Paint, you might want to pre-multiply it. And also, make sure this is unticked. If this is ticked, it will read the background as white. If this is unticked, it'll display a checkered mark, which means there's nothing on it. So this is good. And I'm going to hit export. and it's just going to save it. These are what the files look like after exporting them. Each image represents a frame. Notice how there's a black mark, and it's because I had nothing on frame 0 in this TV Paint file. I actually left that blank. And you know what? You can always just delete that. Next, we're going to import this image sequence into After Effects. So I'm going to just import them. Alright. So here's the dog dancing. You can select one of the files from your sequence and make sure PNG sequence or whatever sequence is ticked. If you save it as a TIFF, make sure that's ticked too. If you save it as anything else in a PNG, but I save it as a PNG for this case. If you want high quality, TIFF or TIFF is good enough. Click open and notice how it stacked all the images into one file. Now here's the problem. It exported it as 30 frames per second, but don't worry, you can always fix this. Right click on your file, interpret the footage and hit main. And I'm going to change this to 24. Now, the thing about image sequences is that it only saves the animation as if you were going to play it once. So in order for me to make it loop many times, you can set this as many as you want, but I'm going to hit 20. 20 is a good number for this case. Now I have my files ready, and I can drop them in the composition window over here. So you just drag them in. These are the videos taken from my iPhone, so forgive the quality. And then I'm going to slap my golden retriever character into the scene. And I'm going to scale him to the size I want for the actual animation. Maybe make him bigger than what I usually had. Alright, I'm going to save it like that. And if you were to play it, notice how everything works. This loops and it's in the right timing. Well, if I played it at a normal speed, this loops and it's played with the right timing instead of 30 frames per second. And also the video is running pretty well. 4 seconds or 5 seconds is good enough for this case. So I'm going to shrink the work area so it can only render this much. When I finally render it, this is good to go. Let's get started. So next, we're going to go into the technical thing that makes this effect work. Motion tracking. What is motion tracking? Motion tracking is basically a technique where you track a piece of important information in your footage or image. In this case, it's a footage where it can keep track of special accents. And these special accents can be anything with huge contrast, specific shapes in your visual information. And what motion tracking does is it tracks the movements or the placement of these accents in the video. If the video is a handheld camera and the camera's shaking, then it can automatically track that. Makes life so much easier instead of having to constantly shift and animate the placement of the character. Now, for me to do that, I need to make sure the accents are much clearer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate my background file. And the thing with After Effects is that with motion tracking, it looks at the image directly. So even if I added effects to it normally, it won't read it. It won't read the effects unless this is in its own composite. So what I'm going to do is go to layer with the duplicate image and pre-compose it, and let's just call it background contrast or prep for motion tracking. You can actually motion track, well, let me get to that later, but if I double click on the thing, or I mean the pre-comp, it's actually it's its own composite window, and I can always go back to my normal composition by clicking this. So for this to actually work, I have to change the effect of the video within the composition. So I go to let's say I want to make those accents clear, so I'm just gonna actually bump up the contrast, brighten it, and adjust it so this is super clear. Now I'm going to go back to my normal composite. Now, before we even apply the motion tracking effect or the motion tracking option, we need to create a null object. And what a null object is, it basically acts as an invisible placeholder. You will not see this in rendering. You can set any size you want for it. It's not going to show up. It's just there to be a placeholder. So in this case, I'm going to parent this to the background after I collected data, and you'll see how this works. So I have to have this created first, or the motion tracking won't read it. Won't read the null, I mean. So I'm going to click back on my background duplicate with the contrast, and I'm going to track the motion. Track camera is for workspaces with 3D environments. This is all 2D, so I'm only going to track the motion. If you guys can't see this tracker window, go to Window, go to Window, and hit Tracker, and it should pop up. So I'm going to track the motion of this. Now it's set automatically to my null object. If I didn't have anything, it won't read anything, and you can't apply it to anything. Alright, so let me explain how these squares work. Everything inside the square is your accent point. So anything you want the motion track, the data to track. Anything outside is not the accent point, but it serves as a reference for, let's say this square loses the accent point. It'll use anything around it to help return it back, and it's useful for footage with a lot of movement. So in this case, because there's not a lot of movement, I can set it pretty small because it's only a shaky cam. And I'm going to make my focal point that small bit, but I want to also track the rotation. So turn on the rotation, and notice it'll open a brand new window. Alright, and I'm going to make sure that it tracks that. Again, not a lot of movement, so I can make it small. Now, I'm going to actually collect the data. Oh, whoops. I think it'll be better if I start at the beginning and readjust it at the beginning. I think that'll be good. That little crevice. Okay, cool. Now we're ready to track it. It doesn't open a new square for scale if I hit scale, but it'll collect that data for it, and it's gonna apply to our null. So in order to collect data, you can either go backwards or forwards, and since I'm starting the beginning, I'm gonna go forward, and now it's just tracking the important bits. And look at this, it shook, so you can always fix that. I'm gonna undo it, and I'm gonna fix it up. Maybe it needs to be bigger, not sure. Let's see. Now let's try again. Adjust it and keep testing it until it works. So I notice it's really shaky, and I just need to keep fixing it. I would say maybe I could use this. This could work. Let's try that accent point. Maybe make it bigger, and let's try it. It's a lot more stable. I think this is good, and I can stop it there because I only want 5 seconds of it. Now I'm gonna hit apply, and what it's gonna do, it's gonna pop up. It's gonna make this pop up, and it's gonna apply to the X and Y dimensions. But it's also gonna read the scale too. It doesn't say it, but it's gonna do that. So if I go to my null object, now there's tracking information, and now it's already affected on the null. So it's already animated for the null. So if I were to play it, oh whoops! Notice how the null moves around with the square. So that's my motion tracking. The thing is, I don't really need this high contrast background. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so all I need to do is hide my background, but the null will still stay there. But my normal background, since I hid it under, is going to show. But every data is already transitioned into the null. So this is how motion tracking works for this case. I could honestly make only the character move by selecting my null. Well, first I select my character and I make sure the parent is on null. So it's kind of like I'm putting it in a folder, and that folder is the null. So in other words, you can move the character around without affecting the null. Meaning if you wanted to place him somewhere else in the scene, you could just move your character animation and not have to move the null, since the null already has the tracking data. Now, let's double check our character with the footage. As you can see, the rotation, the scale, and the positioning matches. Everything matches except the colors and the lighting of the dog, which I feel does not match the atmosphere of the footage. The atmosphere of the footage is a bit more mid-tone-ish, I would say a bit more darkly lit, whereas our character is brightly lit, very high in vibrancy, and strong line art. Everything seems superimposed on the image. So he doesn't look like he's actually in the scene. So what we want to do is add all these after effects, these compositing effects such as shadows, such as lighting, to make him actually feel like he's actually there. So what I'll need to do first is I need to pre-compose my dog. So again, layer, pre-compose, and let's call this Bon Dances primary. And if you double click on it, it actually opens its own separate timeline. So I actually want to be able to see my dog and the background at the same time. So what we need to do is make a new comp viewer. So we hit our arrow up here and hit new comp viewer. And we'll make this our primary our viewpoint for our dog, whereas this one will actually look at what's outside of it. So now we're ready to actually edit the dog and its colors. So I'm going to, the first thing I want to do is subdue the lighting of the dog and make its colors match the overall atmosphere of this footage. And by looking at it, I can kind of sense medium tone, medium, gray, mid-tone, brown. So I'm going to go back to my pre-composite here. I'm going to hit new, and I'm going to make a solid. And I'm going to choose a color, and what you can do is actually hit the eyedropper tool and select whatever dominant color is there. And I'm thinking it's a darker brown. Alright, so now everything I do here will affect the composite here, because this composite is actually in there. So just to make it super clear. Alright, so going back to this timeline, one thing I just noticed is you need to make this there we go. And in this one, well, I don't know why it's doing that. So let's lock, I think you have to lock this first and then go here. There we go. So that's something I just forgot to do. Then I'm going to just work on this, because sometimes, you know, it doesn't show the timeline for this, so just lock this. Or you can click the tab that has your character animation composite. I'm going to hit this tick box, lock the transparency, so everything the square everywhere this brown square goes, it's not going to leave the silhouette of the dog. So now I can actually add some blend modes, or think of this as like you're putting a cell over a plastic cell over a character. So I'm going to play around with the blend modes. There's hard light. I think that's still a bit too saturated. There's overlay. That kind of just makes it stronger. Something I don't want. I think darken is pretty close, but the one I'm thinking about is multiply. Even though it darkens it, it kind of subdues the contrast. Then I'm going to turn down the opacity. So now it sort of matches with the lighting. He's in the shadows, so he's relatively dark. One thing about light is that some secondary light will bounce off to surfaces, so meaning that if even though there's no direct light hitting the dog, there's other secondary light, such as the bounce from the ground or the floor, to give in that secondary lighting. And I'm going to emulate that by kind of adding a sort of gradient effect over the shadow. So what I did was I selected the pen tool and masked out a shape that would represent the light bouncing off. And I'm going to make that inverted, so the light actually comes from below, because that's where most of the light source is coming from. Then I'm going to hit this arrow, and I'm going to feather the hell out of it. So there's more of a gradiency. But I don't like how bright this is, so I'm just going to edit it a bit. Just adjust it. Make it more subtle. You can always do a bit more extra work to make sure the feet are more intricate in terms of the mask. But honestly, I'm just going to do this much so that you get the idea. Maybe a bit lower. Just, it's a small gradient. Okay. And I'm probably going to bump up the opacity. So that's looking closer to the atmosphere of the overall place. I want to add some shadow to our dog. I could go back to my TV Paint files and actually paint the shadows, but in all honesty, I don't have time for that. And there's a faster way to do that. In your pre-composite, right-click on your your dancing character, and go to Layer Styles and Inner Shadow. And this is going to open a new blend mode or layer style. I am going to bump up the size. I'm going to change the distance a bit. And I'm looking at this one here, but you can also see how it's actually being affected here. And then I'm going to adjust the shadows so it looks a bit more natural. That's probably too dark, so 75% will do. It's not perfect, but you get the idea that we're getting closer to our finished look. Alright, so now I want to play around with other effects outside of our dog character. So I can lock this and unlock this. Sometimes when you unlock it, you need to reselect what window you're viewing. Okay, so I'm going to add another layer effect. It's an inner shadow still. But the thing is, instead of acting like a shadow, I'm actually going to make it act like the light. So I can select my colors from here. I'm going to make it match maybe a bright color. And I'm going to set it to linear dodge, and linear dodge affects everything, including the line art. If I did color dodge, you could still see the line work, so it kind of flattens it out. Linear dodge just does it to everything. I'm going to change the angle a bit. I can play around with the distance, and I can play around with the size of it. And I think this will do for now. Again, it's not perfect, but it'll do. So this is me adjusting the lighting so it matches the lighting here. So I'm going to adjust. There we go. And then I'm going to test it out, see how it looks. So we have our actual character with some of the lighting done in blend modes. And the reason why I did the shadows inside the character and the lighting outside of the character is because the thing with layer styles is that you can't apply the effect more than once on the same layer. That's kind of why I pre-composite it, and also it just makes things easier to organize. Whereas if I wanted to move this character and change the lighting, for example, or the angle of the lighting, it's easier for me to do that. Okay, everything seems to get closer to what we want. Next, let's figure out the shadows or the reflection down here. Alright, so I'm just going to keep this open just in case, but I'm going to shrink it so I can focus more on this composite. Next, we're actually going to play around with the shadows, or trying to implement sort of a shadow and a reflection. The first thing I want to do is actually make the shadow of this. So let's get started. In fact, I don't think we're going to see any lighting effects in the in the reflection. You could do that, but for this case, I don't find it too important since I'm going to blur a lot of it. You'll see what I mean. So I'm just going to select my dancing character, unedited, and I'm going to flip him upside down. And then I'm going to place him under my dancing dog layer and adjust him accordingly. We can pre-compose this soon, actually. Alright, so now we have something that bears a resemblance of the dog's reflections. Okay, then we need to parent it to our null object again. So when we play it, it's already there. It already matches with the overall movement of the camera. Okay, so here's the tricky thing. There's so many ways you can do this. You can actually edit it right on the spot, but I like the idea of keeping things organized, so we're going to pre-compose it. Let's pre-compose the reflection. So bonbon reflection. So now I'm going to lock this. I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to change this viewer into the reflection. So even though it's upright, it's actually upside down. You can actually make it set upside down like this. If, let's say here, I'll show you how to do that quickly. Instead of clicking leave all attributes and bottom reflection, such as transformation, like what I did here, you can click this, which moves everything, including its transformation into your pre-composite. Okay, so let's get started on this. One thing I want to do is I'm going to add, let's say, a dark blue color. And you know what? I'm just going to do something like this and make it dark blue, or purple in this case. And then I'm going to transparency lock it, like I did with the shadow. So you can hard light it. I like to multiply things. Maybe darken. Just keep playing around with it. That's pretty cool. I actually like how that looks, but I think it makes the outlines too visible. Let's just stick to multiply. And I'm going to go click back on my bonbon layer, and I'm going to actually kill the contrast a bit. So now the tension is here, and also it's a lot more subdued here. Alright, cool. So that's looking closer to what we want. We can actually set a new layer. We can even make this match even more. So I'm going to actually make it match the bright lighting of the window. So I'm going to adjust it maybe on top of our character. Maybe we can actually just create a mask that bears a resemblance for the top part. And then we edit the mask again. So we go to masks and we feather it. So that's getting a bit closer. We can set that mode to lighten. It's all up to you what you want to do. But the thing is, it kind of makes it look weird because it doesn't really match this part. I feel like it kind of makes it look like its own thing. So one way to trick that is, instead of doing the technique that I showed you earlier, one thing you can also consider, which I might just use in this case, is actually masking our dog. So I'm selecting the dog, and I'm going to make that same shape as I did earlier. And then I'm going to invert that mask, so he kind of looks like he's been cut on his head. And then we're going to feather it. So that looks a bit better. It's actually matching the tone of the wall there, the reflection of the wall. And you can always adjust it to make it match even more. Okay, so I think we're getting closer to what we want. And then I do feel like it's still very sharp. It doesn't really match the blurriness of the reflection. I like to maybe darken the dog a bit. And then I'm going to fast blur that dog too. So he seems a bit more relative to the reflection. Oh, excuse me. That's my alarm. Cool. And then you can keep editing this and make it more authentic. I don't like this, so I'm still gonna keep blurring it. What you can do is you can create an adjustment layer. An adjustment layer acts as this filter, this shape that acts as a filter. So only anything above, any effect that's added on this adjustment layer will affect anything under it. So in this case, I'm going to do it with the dog. So notice how everything I did in fast blur affected the reflection of the dog. All right, cool. So I like how it starts off as somewhat clear, but I wanted to blur it out as it gradually gets down. So I'm actually going to create another mask, and let's make it halfway of the dog, and then I'm going to blur it a bit. So notice how this is getting more blurry. I don't like that sharpness, so you can always go to the mask of your adjustment layer and feather it so it smoothens out. Alright, so there we have it with that character at least. So let's play it. Let's play what we have so far. So now it's getting more believable, more realistic. I would say believable. I don't like the word realistic as much because again, you can debate how realistic this looks, but in all honesty, it just looks like it's there. Even though it's a bit more, it's ill-planned, it's good enough. Okay, now we can add things such as shadows. And I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm not going to add as much effects. So I'm going to create another Bonbon character, place it over the reflection, but under the main character. I'm going to flip him upside down. And I am going to actually kill all color and all contrast. So I'm going to go to, I think, you can do this in so many ways. I think hue and saturation is the best way. You turn down the lightness for that. So if you want to make it really black. Oh yeah, I want to colorize it actually. So lightness, kill that. Either or. But I'm just going to create a black shape. And I'm going to flatten him. You can actually add blend modes to this one if you wanted to. So hard light. Oh, let's unlock this. You can set it to hard light. You can set it to overlay. I think overlay still makes things look sharp. Multiply is good. And I'm going to probably blur it. So I'm going to fast blur it. And I'm going to kill the opacity a bit. And make it match closer. So if we play it, oh, I think I forgot to parent it. Yeah, I forgot to parent it. So parent it to your null. I'm going to save this. And I'm going to play it. So we're getting closer to what we want. Maybe the shadows are a bit too harsh. I'll change it to overlay. And just make it more subtle. So that's looking a bit better. I mean, it's one of those things where you just have to keep playing with the effect until you get the desired effect that you want. So actually I'm going to, you can actually, there are ways to distort it. I use color pin, which is kind of like taking the pins from each end and you adjust it so it matches the perspective, but there's a lot to work with. So that's that's one shadow. I want to create another shadow, and this is the last thing I'll do to make just to make it look a bit more authentic. So I'm going to create another one, and what you can actually do is go to your shadow. Actually, I can always rename it here. So you can right click, rename shadow, so it's easier for me to organize. I'll rename the shadow 2. I'm going to put it around the same areas where the original shadow is, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy every effect here and just slap it on shadow 2. And then I can probably put it somewhere over here. I could do the corner pin to make it match with the perspective, but then again, it is a lot of time. I know it doesn't look believable, but it's close to what we want. We can kind of believe that there's somewhat of a cast shadow here. I do think the shadow here is a bit too harsh, or the opacity, so I'm just going to kill it down a bit. And then let's play the sucker. Alright, now let's do one more thing. And this one more thing is probably going to make everything match with the overall footage. So I'm going to select the main dancing dog, and I'm going to duplicate him. And I'm going to set his blend mode to lighten. And what lighten does is it kind of creates this, it's a blend mode that kind of creates this sort of effect that only highlights the lighter values of your original shape or footage. And I'm actually going to blur it out just a bit so it matches with the overall atmosphere. I'm going to turn down the layer styles because I think the layer styles takes a lot out of it, like that outer glow. So I think it's also reading the highlight effect that we did. And notice how it's too strong. I'm going to actually turn down the opacity of that. So now it sort of matches the haziness of our footage. So let's play that again. Alright, so that's how I basically did motion tracking. That's how I would do motion tracking as a first get-go. Things such as lighting effects, that's something that we can talk about later. So there you have it. Easy, right? That's basically how I did it. Again, there are so many ways to problem solve this to make it look more believable. One thing I would have considered is added a secondary lighting, and I did that while I wasn't recording. So if I double clicked on my primary dance layer, I actually made a lighten layer. You can actually adjust it anywhere, and I'm probably going to make it set around here, and I'm going to mask it. So you can do things like this to keep making the image more believable. Maybe that's a bit too strong, but again, it's just a lot of problem solving. You just have to keep playing around with it. But that's okay. Again, it's one of those things where you just have to keep experimenting with it. It might not be perfect, but that's totally fine. Again, I would just keep adjusting it so it looks a bit more lifelike, but this is fine for now. Actually, what I had earlier was better. Before we conclude this video, I actually want to show you guys some other examples that I did earlier, such as this one, on top of the balcony. Again, it's just a lot of problem solving, a lot of layer comps where we figure out the lighting, making the lighting match. It's all basically the same. One thing I want to show is this one. This one actually has a more specific lighting effect where I actually made a few shapes to bear resemblance of the lighting of the trees found in the grass here to match with the dog. So if I were to double click on my dancing dog, and I think it's this one, yes, it's this one. So there are two things going on here. One is an adjustment layer that acts, it's basically a glow effect that makes every high value glow and give off this radiance. And the other one is the actual lighting. So it's actually a solid grayish brown with lots of masks set on it. What I also did, so if I click on the mask layers here, there's a lot of different masks, and you can just keep making shapes in, making them subtract. So they're constantly subtracting stuff. Another thing that I did is the corner pin that I was talking about, and that effect is to distort the perspective or the shape of the effect. Yeah, basically the shape of the overall thing. So I actually animated it, and what I actually did with the animation is I basically did it to every single drawing. Notice how they're all in step? They're all in every single drawing, while matching the exposure of each drawing. So again, those are the effects. Oh, hold on, I need to turn back on the layer. So one thing I want to conclude is that it's just a lot of problem solving. You just have to keep playing around with it and figure out what effect fits the best for your character and for the overall footage. Another effect that I want to show you guys is, or another composite, sorry, is the one with the camera movement. And with this camera movement, I actually matched the tracking points with the intricate patterns of the carpet, which made the effect easy to solve with the motion tracking. So if I were to play that, here's me simulating the camera move. I actually turned on motion blur effects for anything that goes on top of the footage, and I turned on the motion blur for our dancing dog. So whenever the camera moves, or let's say in this case, whenever the null moves that's matched to the tracking points, it's going to affect the movement of the dog, and any movement will be read and played, or will be read, and a motion blur will be treated on top of it. Anyways, that's all I wanted to show you. I hope this helps, and I can't wait to see you guys what you come up with. Please send it my way. I'd love to feature it sometime if you guys do an experimentation like this. So, thank you so much. You guys have a good one. A big thank you to my supporters at Patreon. If you guys liked videos like this and you want to see more, please check out my Patreon account and give me a support. If you guys do, you're rewarded to stuff that I never really upload online publicly. Anyways, thanks again.